Okay.
It is okay. It's very okay. It's Migrating to Australia, the podcast, which is okay. Do you give it the okay thumbs up, Mr. David Bongiorno? Migration. To be correct, David, are you a migration practitioner or an immigration practitioner?
Well, it's all changing on the 22nd of March. And at the moment, under law, to be a dispenser of migration advice, we need to be migration agents. And of course, I'm an immigration lawyer. But the profession splits on March 22, and I am purely an immigration lawyer, no longer a migration agent. It's an offence under law to talk and dispense migration advice if you're not a migration agent up until the 22nd.
And then you're an immigration lawyer. And if I call you a migration lawyer, somebody from the department's going to come and kick down the door of the studio and drag me off in chains.
Well, you know what happens? I call myself an immigration lawyer already and a migration agent, but the Legal Service Board is referring to us from March 22 as migration lawyers. So what's in the name, Grant? What's in the name? I'll tell you what's a good name we have, a good person we have, a very interesting, our first doctor, Dr. Ram Nadatha. Welcome to the Migrating Australia podcast.
Thanks, David.
And David, you went Aussie on me. You went Aussie on me, didn't he, Ram? He got that. He Australianized your name. That was worse than I expected to do, David.
We're having Dr. Ram on because he is the first. Well, he's a citizen of the world. We haven't had anybody who's a citizen of three nations. Well, I mean, officially, you're an Australian, an Englishman, and you're an overseas citizen of India. Can you tell us about what overseas citizen of India actually means?
Right. Actually, I haven't officially become an overseas citizen of India, so I'll have to admit that. But I will be applying. But overseas citizen of India, I believe, is it's called an OCI card. It's in a constant flux of change at the moment. I believe with the current Prime Minister of India and the Indian Foreign Department is just reviewing it. India doesn't actually allow dual citizenship. So what was started was originally what was called a PIO card, a person of Indian origin card, which allowed certain rights and privileges that Indians had if they had given up their citizenship. Now, at the same time, what was introduced was what was called an OCI, an Overseas Citizen of India, which is not actually a true citizenship. You've got a passport-like document, but basically it gives you a permanent visa, it gives you work rights, it gives you rights to study there, it gives you rights to purchase property, with some exceptions. Some sensitive property or agricultural property cannot be bought out by foreign nationals, so they're quite strict about that. And obviously you can't serve as a member of parliament, nor can you serve in the armed forces or have certain government jobs which are sensitive, which I guess it's something that's interesting looking at what's been going on here in Australia recently. But a lot of Indians, and the Indian NRI, which is the non-resident Indian population, I think it's the largest in the world. It's bigger than China, and I believe I'm not sure of the actual number, there may be 30 to 40 million Indians overseas, and they have done very well in every country that they've gone, particularly the United States. I think they have, more than 1.5 million. The UK has about 2 million, and then Australia now has, I believe, about 600,000 to 700,000 people of Indian origin. And this is a popular concept because it allows you to go back to the mother country without having any visas. And most Indians, particularly those who have ties still with back home with India, visit there regularly, particularly during the festive season, and have a lot of family connections and so on. And travel has become, COVID pandemic aside, has become very easy, very smooth, and a lot of the red tape's gone, so it's very easy. I mean, even if you don't opt for the PIO or the OCI card, to get an Indian visa now, it's all done online, and within 24 hours you can get a visa for up to 1 year multiple entry. So the whole paradigm has changed, and there's a lot of cultural and business connections between Australia and India, not just people of Indian origin, but famous personalities like Steve Waugh. I believe Ricky Ponting has some business connections, and other people, and Glenn McGrath spends his time working between there and here, where he runs the MRF Pace Academy, which was previously run by Dennis Lilly. So you've obviously seen I've used a lot of cricket examples because I'm a bit of a cricket tragic.
Ram, if you don't mind, before we talk about your professional career and the journey to Australia with your medical career, can you give us an idea of um, uh, what your childhood path was to get into medicine?
Okay. My childhood path was very different. I didn't consider medicine as a career initially. It's a gradual interest that developed. I actually started off my career as a physiotherapist. So I worked actually for 10 years as a physiotherapist, and that I did my physiotherapy degree in Sydney at the University of Sydney. And I actually spent 5 years in Sydney. 4 years for the degree, and then working for a little while. And then after that, I came back to Melbourne because that's where my family was based. And then I worked in Melbourne. Then I went, like many people in Australia, for the working holiday. And I spent a couple of years in Britain, which sort of started my taste and enjoyment of Britain. And I traveled throughout Europe. I came back and I did some private work, private practice, and I did more government work. And then after that, I spent a little bit of time in the United States as a physio in Texas. So I have a license to practice as a physiotherapist in Texas. So that's how my connection with America started. And then I traveled around and I'd been involved with some volunteer work and some research in rehabilitation and diabetes and a few other things. And that took me to different parts of the US, including a lot of the southern states, including Florida. And then from there, I'd met a few people who sort of reignited my interest in medicine. And I thought, look, I came to a junction in my career where either I would continue with physio and perhaps do a PhD and become an academic, or I would continue on the path of a clinician, but maybe take it to a slightly different level. And that's where medicine was an option. And I had an opportunity there, and there was a medical school that was a British based or British trained medical school. So that gave me the options to transition smoothly back to Britain if I wanted to, and eventually Australia as an option. So my journey to medicine was not traditional, but it was more well thought out as a mature student with life experiences, and it's a gradual sort of transition. And I think from that point of view, I think I was very pleased to do it that way.
As a mature age student, you'd lived a life and you'd also studied. How, for people listening, and you're never too old to go back to school, you may be too old to migrate. What are some of the tricks you learned as a mature age student to help with the rigors of medical degree?
I think it's just having life experience, relating to people. And I think studying smart was important. I think when you're young, you either study excessively or you don't bother studying. You don't actually utilize your time. You're not smart about things. But as you get older, I don't think your energy levels necessarily go away. I mean, I wasn't that old when I studied medicine. I was 32. But I became much more efficient and smart. I knew what not to waste time, what to not to do useless things. Like I remember when I did my first degree, a lot of the youngsters, what they used to do is they used to take notes. This was before the era of taping and webcams and podcasts and so on. They used to take notes, come back home, rewrite the notes beautifully, and then or type them up and then use them to study. What I realized is actually the most important thing is to listen, to write notes, however scrappily they look, because it's for yourself, then take them home and just highlight them and don't bother rewriting them. I mean, you can add your readings to it and so on. So simple things like that made a huge difference because I wasn't doubling up my work. I just came home, read through my notes, and I made sure I read them straight after I came home that evening. So if I went to lectures in anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, which was pre-medical, then I made sure I read them. And then I obviously had a study group that I was involved with. So those are the sort of things that are important. And the other important thing is I went to a medical school which was both didactic and problem-based learning, which means it wasn't just volumes of knowledge, but knowledge was sort of incorporated in body systems to learn. So which made it more suitable for mature students because you looked at concepts rather than just facts. And the other important thing, and which was useful, is the medical school encouraged early clinical interaction. So from first year, you got to take histories from patients, talk to patients. Not that at that level you're going to make interventions or anything, but definitely what was valued was people skills, communication rather than just rote learning. And I think that suits the mindset of a mature student. So anyone I'd advise, not just in medicine, but any course to do it as a mature student is just use the inherent skills, particularly the communication skills and the wisdom that you have. in addition, the life experiences, and also choose a course or an institution that's more practical rather than just didactic. And I think that was the biggest learning point, which, you know, made a huge difference. Looking back, if I had done medical school as an 18-year-old, sure, I would have finished earlier, finished quickly, but I don't think I would have brought the life experiences. And similarly, I wouldn't have benefited from all the knowledge and wisdom that I had. So it was a much more balanced life I had as a medical student than compared to perhaps an 18-year-old.
Are any of these schools in Australia based on that practice that you mentioned, or are they all rote learning institutions?
I think it's changing now. I believe that, for example, the University of Melbourne has a 4-year postgraduate degree, and it's based on the Harvard Medical School. So it's very practical. It's got a research element. 4 years is quite intense, but I believe there's some practical time because I have come across a few of the students from the University of Melbourne. I've taught them, and they seem to be reasonably switched on, and they're an older age group. Some of them go on and do a Master of Public Health or a PhD while they're doing medicine at the same time, and they're from different walks of life. So that's a good thing. Monash is also moving in that way, and I think the other good new medical school, which was quite surprising, I've had a few students from there, is the Deakin University Medical School, and that's been quite good because it's very practical, and the students seem to reflect that practicalness. And then also a range of environments they come from. A lot of people come from, you know, allied health, like myself, a few who have been nurses, some of them have even been accountants and so on, and have decided, you know, I want a career change, or I've always wanted to do medicine. But finally, with all the other commitments I've had time for myself rather than just, you know, family pressures or other pressures.
Ram, it's an interesting specialty that you're in, emergency medicine. How is it different to become a specialist in emergency medicine than taking on one of the other specialties in the medical field?
Okay, I think the key to this word is 2 words, I would say. First is generalist, second is acute care. And I'll explain what that means. A generalist is a person like, you know, an all-rounder in cricket who's good at batting, bowling, probably fielding. So they have knowledge of everything. They have fairly in-depth knowledge of everything. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean that they're very superficial. However, they need to know everything. So, for example, in my training in emergency medicine, I had to know every specialty. So from obstetrics and gynecology to pediatrics, to trauma, to cardiology, to you know, kidney disease, to coughs and colds, to ENT, all these things, to some public health, all these things. So you need to be a generalist. The other generalist specialty is general practice. Now, the second word that I've used is acute, so generalist and acute. GPs, they do see acute cases, but they tend to see chronic conditions, meaning that they have a set number of patients who they've worked with for a number of years, or the practice has dealt with for many years, so they keep coming back. So they have continuity of care. They have often chronic conditions. So this is very different from emergency medicine. Emergency medicine, yes, sure, we have some chronic patients come in. We often call them frequent flyers because they keep coming back for the wrong reasons, often mental health issues or drug and alcohol issues. However, we tend to be an acute specialty, so we just see things where we use a very familiar word, or 3 words: see, treat, and street. So in other words, we like to see patients, we like to treat them and quickly solve whatever we can, and then we'd like to street them. Street doesn't mean necessarily we push them back onto the street. There's 3 things that usually happens with emergency medicine patients, the ones who walk in or brought in by ambulance. They're often admitted. That's to the specialties, or they can be seen in the department and then treated and sent home. We often have a short stay ward, which is a 24-hour ward. It's apparently the busiest ward in any hospital because we have usually 24 beds depending on the hospital, and it's the highest turnover rate ward-wise because it's constantly patients are going in and out, but it's completely run by the emergency department. It hasn't nothing to do with the rest of the hospital. So we tend to be a generalist. As I said, we need to know everything, but at the same time, we have to be acute. Now, this is very different from other specialties who go into much more depth into their specialty. For example, a neurosurgeon is the expert on brain disorders, neurological disorders, anything to do with brain cancers, brain tumors, trauma of the brain, and so on. We're expected to know basic knowledge how to stabilize the patient with brain injuries or a brain-involved condition. for example, stroke, but we're not expected to provide the prolonged care. So from that point of view, we have general knowledge, we have acute knowledge, but our aim is to dispose the patient. When I mean dispose, I don't mean to get rid of the patient, but to make a decision as far as whether they need to be admitted, whether they need to go home, whether they need to be referred to another specialty. So we treat or rather we greet, treat, and street, whereas the other specialties take on the admission and the more chronic condition, or spend more time with the patient. So we're generalists and we tend to be more acute. So I hope that sort of gives you the flavour of what we do. However, we are expected to know a little bit about everything, or a considerable about everything. And I can give you an example of a typical day I've had, and that would give you an idea of what happens.
Before you do that, Ram, sorry, David, before you continue on, one of the joys of doing a live stream is that people contribute some questions. And Ram, I've got two that have come in, and one of them I think will need opinion from you, and one of them I think is a really interesting question. But the first one is coming from someone who's working in the medical field, when do you think Australia will open its borders?
I think it's a tricky one, because it's not just the layer of medicine. I think if you look back when COVID started, people were so anxious about having ventilators, the number of ICU beds and so on. And that's completely disappeared, because clinically, there's no evidence that everyone needs an ICU bed or ventilators. In fact, high flow oxygen has been the thing that's predominantly required, oxygen bottles and high flow oxygen, or oxygen off the wall. That's number one. Secondly, that's the thing that's occurred, is that we've realized that this is a public health problem rather than just a medical problem. But public health means that we need to look at the determinants, the distribution, the causative factors of medicine, or public health issues. And you might have heard of the famous case of John Snow. Have you heard of John Snow? He was a famous epidemiologist in London in the Victorian age, and he is responsible for the management of cholera. He was called the father of treatment of cholera. London at those times, water was supplied by different places, Lambeth, Southwark, and I can't remember the other one. There's 3 different companies that supplied water. Certain parts of London were infested with cholera and the other parts were not. And he investigated why this was the case, and that was to do with the water company that was supplied that part of London. So he realized that in those days they used to think there was miasma or something in the air that caused diseases. That was not the case. As we all know, cholera is as an organism that's waterborne, and obviously the water that supplied that part of London affected. So the relevance of this to that question is that when we talk about reopening, we can't just consider about the medical aspects, but we need to consider about the public health aspects. Public health includes vaccination, and also continuing of social distance, safety, containment, all these things, which brings us to the issue of quarantine, and also general safety and so on. And that's something that's evolving and changing. When we first had the COVID outbreak, we were all concerned only about the medical aspect, but that's completely changed now. It's more public health, containment, and vaccination, so prevention. So as far as reopening is concerned, I think it's going to be very much dependent on how we can control and regulate what's going on. Ironically, we've shut our borders now completely, so we don't have any sort of influx of people coming in, hardly. But at the same time, there's a lot of sort of quarantine centres which are underfilled and overfunded. So you probably read in the newspaper that a lot of money has been poured into the quarantine centres despite the controversy, but a lot of money is being used without actually much occupancy. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Again, I'm not a politician, I'm a clinician, so I don't claim that I have all the political answers. So that needs to be addressed, in my humble opinion. And the other thing is perhaps look at options like, have airports which are close to areas that can, quarantine people without having the risk of having them in the centre of the city. I mean, Avalon, I believe, is more out in the sticks compared to Tullamarine, so that's something that needs to be considered. The other thing interesting in my area of other training is aviation medicine. If you've seen from my CV recently, I'd finished my diploma in aviation medicine. It was very interesting because I learned a lot of things about COVID-19. A couple of the papers I wrote for my diploma involved public health issues like travel in the era of COVID-19. The most important thing I realized was that actually aircraft are quite safe. The problem is not spreading within an aircraft, but the fact is it can act like a vector. That means bringing people with an infection. So as far as opening up the borders, we need to have will from both the point of entry, that overseas country, and the point of exit, which is in Australia. So if those areas need to be addressed before we can consider about opening up the borders. And the other thing is that keeping a closed border is not going to work forever because there's severe economic consequences, particularly in a globalized world that we have. So I'm not saying that we should open up our borders for everyone, but I think travel bubbles are the way to go. But even to achieve that, for example, with New Zealand, a lot of groundwork needs to be done both at the point of entry, which is New Zealand, and the exit points, which is in Australia, wherever passengers land. So that's something that needs to be addressed.
The second question, you sort of started going there, and I think this is one that the community is going to be grappling with over the next year or so. Do you think that it's ethical for countries to require visitors to get vaccinated first?
Well, ethics aside, often a precedent is always considered. When I traveled to the Caribbean and South America, and part of the requirements for there was to have a certificate of yellow vaccine. So the precedent has been set before. It's not like we're talking about the yellow fever vaccines being there for decades. So I think it's not a question of being unethical. It's a reasonable sort of prerequisite. Even for migration, I believe that you need to have TB screening. And in the 80s, they used to have the BCG vaccination and so on. I remember having a BCG vaccination at school in 1981. And from a personal experience, it's interesting because my father used to be the head of the TB service in Victoria, and he worked for the Commonwealth government. He was a physician as well, and he was involved with a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, Laos, and so on, working with a lot of boat people. So he was a very interesting man. He knew a bit of Cambodian and Laotian and some Vietnamese as well to speak to, because he had a lot of those patients. And if you might remember, there was the Kingston Centre. There was also 555 Collins Street. I don't know whether you're in Department of Health and Human Services, which was the Commonwealth, which was involved with immigration and TB screening. So I think to say that it's ethical or not ethical, I don't think it's relevant. It's more to say whether that is there been a precedent done before? Is there a clinical and sort of a biological as well as a public health rationale? Absolutely. If you look back at the history of mankind or humankind, you can see that three things have revolutionized our society health-wise. Do you want to guess what those three things are? If I have to ask either of you,
Polio
just
vaccine.
based on general knowledge. Vaccination,
vaccine.
yeah.
Vaccination.
Okay. What's another?
Clean
Vaccination, yes,
water.
that's one thing.
Delivery of
public
clean
health,
water.
yeah.
Yep.
And what's the other thing? Well, there's several things.
The agriculture, the production of food over a wider area.
Penicillin.
Yeah, all of those things have. But for health, there's actually three important things. First is radiology. So Pierre and Marie Curie, the discovery of radiation, radiology and X-rays, that enabled us to look inside the body and diagnose fractures and other things, and chest infections and so on. So often, previously, people did things blindly and people used to die of fractures and so on. So that's one thing. The second thing is antibiotics. I think it's Sir Ian Fleming. Not Ian Fleming, or is it Fleming Institute? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Ian Fleming, it's right. It's interesting because my father actually met him, and I've got one of the souvenirs as an autograph. In the 1950s, he came to my dad's medical school. So my dad actually met him. So Fleming is the other one. So antibiotics, radiology, and the third thing you guys said was immunization. That's changed things massively. If you look at polio, even cholera, typhoid, and smallpox has been eradicated. Now they actually don't actually give the smallpox vaccine, because I think the last case of smallpox was in Africa in the 1980s. And it's completely eradicated now. I think smallpox, ironically, is only kept in two places, by the Russians and the Americans, and they keep it as a biological weapon, potentially. So that's interesting. But
Ram, you were vaccinated this week. Which
that's
vaccine
right,
did you
yes.
take?
Yeah, well, I actually got the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is the Oxford vaccine. I was actually expecting the other one, the American one, the Pfizer one, but unfortunately, the place that I had vaccination, which was Western Hospital Sunshine, they ran out of the Pfizer, so I ended up getting the AstraZeneca. But I mean, long term, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's the one that people were talking about, blood clots and so on. But the numbers are so small and it's so isolated. There's no evidence clear cut for that. So I had my vaccination about 3 days ago, and I did have a very sore arm, and I felt a bit of a headache, a bit sort of feverish the next day. But the day after, it completely disappeared, and I feel fine now. And my next one is due between 4 and 12 weeks. So unfortunately, I can't change over to the Pfizer, but I will definitely have the second AstraZeneca vaccine, and I look forward to completing my course of vaccination, which I'm very pleased to have. I mean, the studies have shown that both have benefits and certain challenges. I can tell you a quick summary if anyone wants to know the differences between the two. Yeah, well, the Pfizer one is an American one. That's the one that's based on messenger RNA, if I'm right. So it uses like the DNA and RNA, without going into too much of the science and the medicine, is an aspect, or the protein and reproduction of the viruses. That's what the Pfizer vaccine's using. So it's not an actual live vaccine. The AstraZeneca is actually a attenuated virus. So in other words, you get the virus and you basically kill or get rid of all the dangerous part, or attenuate the dangerous parts of the virus. So the vaccine that I was vaccinated with was the actual coronavirus, but without the nasty bits. So how this works is that when the body is exposed to a virus, it recognizes the virus, and it forms antibodies against the virus. So immunization starts. Okay, so you need 2 doses of it, because an initial dose provokes the immune system, and that's why you get the reaction that I did, which is slightly flu-like symptoms, aches and pains, feeling a bit unwell. So that's a good sign, actually. That means your body is starting to kick into effect. And this is an inactivated virus, so there's no risk of actually getting the virus. I mean, it's like some of the flu viruses are actually inactivated viruses. The polio virus, which is called Sabin, is also inactivated virus. So it's actually, you get injected with polio, or you take a syrup of polio, because it's orophycal route is how polio is spread, through contaminated water and poor toilet facilities. So basically, you get exposed to the virus, but a mild form of the virus, and the body develops immunity to the virus. That's the AstraZeneca. The Pfizer actually uses proteins or mRNA from the virus, and that's an aspect of the virus which is the building blocks of the virus, which again is recognized by the body, and it forms the antibodies. Both work in different ways, but the end result is the same. I think the clinical efficacy of both is pretty similar. It's above 80%, and it's interesting to compare that with the flu vaccine, because the flu vaccine only has about 60% effectiveness, whereas our COVID-19 vaccines, we're looking at 85, 90%, maybe more than 90%. I mean, we're still finding out what's happening, but I would strongly advise anyone to get the vaccine if it's offered, because it's a good thing. And historically, we've realized vaccination has been a very important cornerstone in improving human life and improving our longevity. If we compare to our ancestors, most of whom died of infectious diseases.
What would you say to the anti-vaxxers who are listening, who not dispute your claims, but basically don't want to know about it? Can you talk about the danger they present to the rest of us?
Well, yes and no. I think, look, if you look at even vaccination with kids, there's a group of people who refuse to vaccinate their kids. Now, as long as enough people, I think it's like 80, I think, for example, the measles vaccine to work, which is part of MMR, mumps, measles, rubella, which is given to kids, you need to vaccinate at least 80% of the population. So as far as no vaccinators are concerned, as long as they're fringe elements, it's not going to be a major issue because 80% of the population will get vaccinated. I think they probably represent, a couple of percent of the population. So it's not critical from the population point of view. However, there may be issues with a lot of childcare centres or schools saying, look, we can't allow your child to come in here because they're not vaccinated. So that's a potential problem. Now, the other thing is in life and everything, and I say this to the anti-vaccinators, is to do research, to do proper literature review, to read information. So much information is available these days in terms of proper, good clinical evidence-based information, which is written in lay people's terms. Basically, we always in medicine weigh positives and negatives. That means we look at the benefits of certain things versus the negativity of certain things. When it comes to vaccinations, yeah, there's risk factors. Autism is not one of them. There's no proven evidence. I believe there was a doctor in Britain who had sort of fudged some of his results and was actually deregistered. And he started this whole trend and published some papers, and he's been totally discredited in Britain now and in the world, and he's not allowed to practice medicine even. I don't remember his name, but he's well known in the medical circles, at least character-wise. So, and this sort of has encouraged a lot of anti-vaccinators. But the fact of the matter is, vaccination may have some adverse effects. I've told you some of them: the aches and the pains, a bit of fever. I can't actually get COVID from having a live vaccine because it's been attenuated. The nasty bits have been taken out. But the negativity is there. The adverse effects are there, which we can deal with medically. Typically, after you've had any vaccination, they keep you in the vaccination centre for 15 to 30 minutes. If you have an allergic reaction or anything, they can give you drugs and medications to sort that out. Simple ice pack, painkillers, Panadol, those sort of things. Now, these are the negative aspects. Of course, there's rarer cases where people have, an extremely unusual reaction, which is often published. However, the benefits are that because of vaccination, we don't have to suffer as much. We can go through life without being a victim of infectious diseases or having severe infectious diseases. Now, this COVID-19 vaccine or the series of COVID-19 vaccines can't completely stop you from getting COVID-19. However, there is very, very good evidence that they're highly likely to prevent it. We talked about 80% coverage. And even in the 20% or 30% of those who end up getting COVID, the form of COVID they get is a very mild, non-life threatening COVID. Now, people need to understand that COVID-19 is not just a flu-like condition. It is much more serious than that. Sure, in the younger population, without any comorbidities, which means other health conditions, they're fine. They may have a mild, moderate, even severe case of flu and recover. However, there's the two issues here. First of all, the vulnerable population of people like in nursing homes over the age of 60 who may have other health conditions like diabetes, heart conditions, high blood pressure, and so on. They are much more susceptible to the strain of COVID that they face, number one. And number two, the body's ability to rebound is much tougher when you get other conditions coming in, decompensation and age and so on and so forth. So, sure, the young people can say, oh, I'll skip the vaccine, or I don't care. There are even instances where people, I believe, had what's known as COVID parties, where they gathered together and they ended up infecting each other and were very smart about it. And actually, that was really crazy. But anyway, the importance of a vaccine is to achieve herd immunity without having 80% of the population being infected. 80, I use the example in measles. You need at least 80% of the population infected before you achieve herd immunity. I think Sweden tried it, Britain tried it initially, and then they realized that it's a disaster. Imagine if 80% of Australia's population were infected with COVID-19, what the death rate would be. It would be phenomenal. We're not a young country in terms of, a lot of the countries in Asia. We have an aging population, so we don't have that advantage of a demographic dividend. So a lot of people will die, and the severity of the disease may not affect the younger people, but they will be the spreaders. And then on top of which, most of the elderly people will have a severe form and probably will die. So, however, if we vaccinate, particularly targeting the vulnerable and those in nursing homes, sure, they'll be exposed to a vaccine which might give them side effects, but they won't die. They may have a mild form and then they will live. So that's the important thing. Any vaccination doesn't completely eliminate a disease, but it reduces the mortality rate. And that's something anti-vaccinators need to understand. It's not just about yourself, but what your responsibility is to the rest of the population, because the way society is developed and the globalization and the interconnectivity of everyone, no one lives in isolation, even in Australia as an island. Everyone is responsible for the planet in their own way.
Ram, our audience is smarter than us. We've been fact-checked. Ian Fleming wrote the James Bond books.
That's what I thought.
Alexander Fleming is
Sir Alexander Fleming. That's what I thought. My mind's on James Bond. Yes, Sir Alexander Fleming.
So we've caught that one before it went out into the world. But I just want to make a comment on vaccinations. My dad had polio, contracted it in the 1930s in Australia, and it's an invisible disease in Australia now, but it's not in many parts of the world. I think Pakistan is sort of the last reservoir of polio. Anyone who thinks that you don't need to protect yourself against disease like that have never seen what it does to people, and crazy. So we've cleared up our fallacious bestowing of greatness on Ian Fleming.
Graham,
yeah, I thought as much. It's the Alexander Fleming Institute.
Ram, you're a senior doctor. You're an emergency medicine specialist. Now, you see a lot of younger doctors come to Australia to study, go through the system, make application for migration and practice medicine in Australia. What's the attraction of medicine in Australia versus medicine in Malaysia, medicine in Singapore, India, the United Kingdom? Why do so many doctors come here?
I think it's the lifestyle. It's the work-life balance here. I mean, mind you, that is changing in emergency medicine. It's not the same as what it used to be. Because emergency departments are getting busier and busier and busier, and the pressure is getting worse and worse. I mean, even with COVID-19, I thought that it would quieten down. It did sort of, but then GPs refused to see patients, so the emergency department became the front line. So it depends on the specialty. I need to qualify that. But still, I think in terms of lifestyle, pay, and so on, I think Australia is very good. Australia and the United States are probably the best in pay for emergency medicine. However, Australia probably has a better work-life balance. It's interesting because I have a couple of friends and colleagues who run the department in one of the private hospitals in Hobart, which I locum in regularly, and they're both trained in New York. And they came here for a holiday a few years ago with their kids, and they realized that they loved the work-life balance. I think they were working in either the Bronx or somewhere else in New York, which was really obviously a deprived area and very, very busy. And they found that the commuting was much worse. They used to take the trains. They lived in Manhattan, and they commuted from Manhattan to the Bronx or wherever they went. And they found that they were in Tasmania. They found that the work-life balance was great. The salary was similar. I don't think it was a major difference. So I think depending on the country, in some countries the salary is better here than there. But I think in most cases people come here because of the work-life balance. However, things are changing. I must qualify that. And as a caveat to anyone coming or anyone pursuing a career in medicine, you need to really enjoy medicine. I say that from the point of view also being a third generation physician. My grandfather, my father, and myself, all three of us were doctors, not my father's father, my mother's father. And I think medicine is something, and perhaps, David, you could share your perspective as a lawyer, that you need to have a passion about. It's not something that, I'll do it. It's a great way to make money. Yeah, sure, the monetary rewards are there. But there's a lot of responsibility when each time I sign a prescription or sign off something as a more senior doctor or any doctor, even the buck stops with every doctor. These days, even junior doctors get litigation and sued and all sorts of things. So we need to be very careful. And as Grant was saying, people are smart and Google savvy. So anything you say or you suggest, people within seconds will cross-check you, and then you need to be very careful what you say and how you say. And with social media, you have to be very savvy. Otherwise, you can be pinned and nailed to the wall. So in some ways, that faith and goodness that we come in as a physician to help our patients must be tempered by the fact that everything we say and do can be used as fact in a court of law. So documentation is absolutely important. I'll give you a very interesting example. Recently, I wrote a prescription for a patient who had chronic pain and who had dental problems, had a history of drug use, but I gave a limited prescription, out of compassion on a weekend on a Sunday in an emergency department for them to obtain oxycodone, just 5 tablets. So they took it to the local pharmacist and they wrote, even though I'd handwritten 5, unfortunately that centre is still using handwritten prescriptions. So they put a 1 in front of the 5 and written a teen after the 5. So it said 5 teen and 1. Fortunately, the pharmacist rang me immediately, took a picture of it and sent it to my phone because I knew him. And then he said, "What do you want me to do, doctor?" And I said, "What's the normal procedure? What do you do?" He said, "Look, actually, I called the local police station because this is dealing with opiates, and I actually, not that necessarily they'll be arrested, but they'll get a cautioning. And is that okay to do?" And I said, "Absolutely," because I said, I gave with good faith and good trust this prescription, and this person has ended up, abusing it. So that's something you need to be mindful. I mean, Australia has a very good medical system. It has a lot of benefits, a good work-life balance. This is from both the physician and the patient perspective. But unfortunately, there's stresses involved because of things like this. And at the same time, we have a good system here, and unfortunately, some patients abuse the system and they try to take it for a ride when the majority of people are quite reasonable. So my advice to people is to do your homework, consider what's involved. It's a good work-life balance, but at the same time, it's not a free ride. It's not necessarily an easy ride, and it brings its own stresses. So you need to look at the whole picture. And medicine everywhere is evolving. Gone are the days when my father was a doctor and there was a lot of gratitude. It was different. A very funny story. When my father was, he migrated from India to Australia. He started his career as a plastic surgeon. He worked with the Meat Workers Union, which was the old trade union clinic you might have heard in Paisley Street in Footscray. People like Moss Cass were involved with that, and he was actually sponsored by Moss Cass. This was back in 1970. I think the Labor Party was in government. It was a different Australia, and the trade unions were involved. So my father used to do a lot of plastic stuff and all that. He started his career as a plastic surgeon, then ended up being a physician at the Royal Melbourne because he changed it from surgeon to a physician. But interesting enough, when he used to be on call, he used to get a knock on the door with a cup of tea and toast by the nurse. So, and there's a lot of gratitude as far as doctors coming in there, and he used to do things for patients out of the blue and additional and stuff without expecting anything in return because people were different. There was a lot more gratitude, less sort of I, me, my. But these days, sure, there's still a lot of gratitude. Rural areas, you see that in rural medicine. But doctors have to be much more savvy and realize that, you can do things out of the goodness of your heart, but it's not always reciprocated like that. And people use social media to blame people, to, turn the tables around, say all sorts of things. And so you have to be very careful. So you can't afford to be naive. So my advice to IMGs is to do your homework, see what it involves, and realize that, there's a lot of good things in terms of work-life balance, but it's not all rosy. So make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into.
Our game are beautiful minds and energetic personalities, people who want to make a difference through medicine. We reap the benefit as Australians of international medical graduates. Do you find it maybe perhaps a little sad that the countries they come from lose this talent to us? I mean, do we owe those countries something in return?
I think that's a reasonable thing, and I'll give you an example of the British medical system compared to the Australian medical system. Um, I think Australia will change with time, but one thing good that Britain has had is that it's heavily relied on the Commonwealth. I mean, with the European Union, that got shut down, but now with Brexit, I think they've gone actually and recruiting doctors from, for example, in Britain, South Asian doctors are huge, like from India and Pakistan, and also they used to have a training visa and so on. So they made the transition much smoother, and then the colleges which run the exams for the specialization in Britain are actually, they have overseas examination centers, so you can train as a British surgeon being in, Dubai, in Egypt, in India, Pakistan, all these places, Malaysia, Singapore. um, However, Australia is much of a closed shop, and it's a closed shop, and I don't think under the guise of medical excellence and so on, there's an element of that, but there's also a bit of closed shop policy and sort of, looking after their own, which I understand. It's a small country and so on, but at the same time, we've moved on. The world has become a much bigger place. There are much bigger players now. Even Britain has changed its mindset. The world center has shifted from, Europe and North America to Asia. India and China are the big future powers and big countries, sheer population and the development and so on that's going on. So, in answer to that question, and also the smaller countries you've mentioned, I think we should look into giving things back in terms of, I'm not asking opening the floodgates, but be prepared to take our knowledge and our college experience overseas. A lot of the Australian colleges refuse to engage involvement overseas, and I think that's not a good thing. Whereas Britain has taken that step forward, and I think that's a good thing. And I think we have a lot of expertise and excellence here, but unfortunately, the mindset is such that we have a siege mentality, where we don't want to necessarily export our knowledge and our expertise. And I think that's part of the problem. So I think if we are prepared to offer training and experience from our colleges overseas and set up an overseas branch of the college, we're less likely to have drainage of expertise and doctors to our shores, because some of the doctors will tend to stay back, or at least the knowledge will be shared with the local training and so on. And I think that's a good thing. If you look at even the American system, so many IMGs or international medical graduates go there. And the irony is that it costs much less to train overseas for a lot of these countries or the individuals, whereas in America, medical school is so expensive. So, of course, the Americans, want to grab these people. And then in return, for them, they can earn without a sort of financial debt. But the sad thing about that is a lot of the knowledge is lost. And I think there is a moral responsibility. Yes, have IMGs, but at the same time, give the IMGs the opportunities to put back something to the country that fostered them and brought them there.
You're going back to the United Kingdom to share your expertise in frontline COVID work. What's prompted that move?
Well, it's a combination of things. I would say, look, I wouldn't say entirely it's altruistic and wanting to do things. I think it's also important to realize that I have some academic things that I want to finish there. And given the restrictions that I've here, I haven't reached my full potential, what I want to do as an ED physician. So there, if I can do a few more things, finish up a few more exams and a few other things, and also I've trained in aerospace medicine. There's opportunities for retrieval medicine and helicopter retrieval and stuff. So those are the sort of skills that I'll get when I go back. And given that it's a bigger country and the NHS is huge, I think it's something that I wanted to go back. I mean, I haven't firmed up plans yet unfortunately, with the things that are happening with COVID. So a few things need to still happen. But that's something that's definitely I would like to do. I mean, I have the benefit of being registered in both countries as a medical practitioner and spending many years and did my training essentially in the UK. But on top of which, being a dual citizen gives me the opportunity to go back there and do stuff, and it's a two-way process. The other interesting thing, and you mentioned about overseas citizen of India. I'm not an overseas citizen of India yet, or something I need to get around to do, but I have been to India every year for the last 10 years. even in Britain, I used to go. And part of, besides obviously holidays and family and friends, my family left there, by the way, 50 years ago, but I've still maintained ties with India, and I enjoy going there. I do some volunteer work in one of the couple of the hospitals, the Apollo hospitals, you might have heard. It's a group of private hospitals, and one of them is the emergency department. So I teach the residents there, and I do a bit of help them with some exam preparation and stuff, which, because they use their examination training is based on the Royal College of Emergency Medicine in the UK. So having done the UK exams, it's something that I'm very much familiar with. So I've helped them with their clinical exam preparation, some teaching, and so on. So every time I go to India, I go to Chennai, and I spend about a week to 10 days there. And part of spending the time there is that I'm involved with teaching at Apollo Hospital. And it's wonderful because, sure, some of them want to leave India and go, but a lot of them have this fierce determination that they want to do something for their country. And they love knowledge of medicine and to share new ideas, and it's very infectious. And I think medicine has always never been a closed shop. It's been a profession where it's been freedom of information. That's why often, whenever there's a vaccination or a medical discovery, we as physicians, along with scientists, want to share it with other colleagues around the world. So to put barriers and a closed shop mentality, for us, it's the worst thing, because the way medicine has advanced is because it's been a freedom of expression, a freedom of thought, freedom of ideas. And in the olden days, if you remember, a lot of Australians used to go to the UK to train in medicine. I mean, until recently. And also even a lot of people with scholarships used to go to Oxford and Cambridge, Rhodes Scholars and so on. And I think that was wonderful. I mean, the Europeans sort of put a stifle on it. But I think with Brexit, hopefully a lot more people from the Commonwealth, particularly from Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, South Africa, will have the opportunity to go back to Britain, and there's a strong connection there. I mean, even when I spent so much time in Britain, I felt there's a lot of connection between Australia and Britain, or India and Britain. It's like a big family. I mean, if you watch the series Crown, it's quite interesting from that point of view, why the Queen takes so much interest. And whether you're a Republican or not, it doesn't matter. There's a sense of a shared experience. We all fought in the same war together. A lot of the institutions that we have, whether it's Australia, India, or the UK, is very similar. I mean, the Indian system, medical system, and in the Indian, if you're in the, I have a couple of relatives who are in the Indian Armed Forces, and it's very British even to this day. The dining, the way they dine, the way the ranks, and so on. That's probably very similar to Australia as well. I mean, you know, probably with the Quad and the military exchanges. I mean, a lot of people didn't realize that Australians and Indians actually fought together on the same side in all the wars, and particularly in Gallipoli and so on, and even in Tobruk and all that. If you go to the Commonwealth memorial and the graves in Tobruk, El Alamein and so on, a lot of the Indians fought on the same side as comrades with the British. And when I was in school as a kid in this country, a lot of people, Australians, didn't know in Anzac Day that besides the Australians and the New Zealanders and the British, the Indians were a big contingent in Anzac, and they fought the Turks. And actually, if you know history, if I diverge a little bit, the Battle of I think it's Haifa, the Battle of Haifa, when, if you remember, Israel was actually part of the Ottoman Empire until they had the Palestinian Mandate, and then it was taken over by the British, I think in 1917. And the Battle of Haifa was largely fought by the Indian Army, who defeated the Turks. And liberated what was Palestine now, which is Israel today, in Haifa. I believe that was commemorated recently with the Israeli Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister, and a memorial was set up. So that's an example of, a First World War battle where the Indians were involved as the allies, and they were involved with liberating what was Turkish-held territory. Similarly, the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, I have relatives who served in Tokyo in the Indian Air Force, and they basically, the Indians, the Australians, and the British were the occupying forces, and they obviously, even in the war crimes tribunals that they had in Tokyo, they had an Indian judge, they had a British judge, they had an Australian judge. So it's interesting. So there's a lot of connection there with the Commonwealth, whether you come from Australia, India, or the United Kingdom. And I think, part of that process, I think medicine in the modern generation, we need to encourage that exchange of ideas. And hopefully when COVID becomes something of the past, we can continue. And I think it's wonderful to have people from different parts of the world come here freely, learn something, and not necessarily just for immigration purposes, but to go back to their own countries and say, look, I've had an Australian friend, or I've had wonderful experiences in Australia, and I've gone back. And I think that shaped my experience at the time as an Australian citizen who went to the UK for the working holiday, the traditional working holiday as a physio, spent a couple of years, and then many years later, I returned back and ended up spending 14 years in the United Kingdom and became a British citizen. And that was no big small explanation. That was because of the experience I had as a working holiday maker. And I hope the same thing. A lot of people who come to Australia are not just coming here just to get an immigration, but also to use it as a life-changing experience, whether they want to stay here permanently or go back to their country and say, look, I understand Australians, and I understand a lot of the good things about Australia, and I've made Australian friends. The same thing,
How
to open up the
when,
world.
Sorry, Ram. When did you acquire Australian citizenship?
Oh, in 1994, I think it was, or 94, February 94, I got my Australian citizen. So I had an Indian passport from 1970 till 1994, 24 years. I was a permanent resident in this country. I mean, I didn't spend all those years here, but 94, I got my Australian citizenship, and then I got my working holiday visa and went to the UK at that time. So I've been an Australian citizen since 1994, and I've been a British citizen since 2013.
Australia playing India in a test game. Where does your allegiance lie?
Let me answer it this way. I don't know whether either of you are cricket tragics, but this year, and I spoke to a lot of Australian friends, everyone was absolutely astounded, enamored, and sort of uplifted by how the Indians, particularly the young Indian team, did despite all the challenges of the bubbles and so on. So as far as cricket's concerned, in all honesty, I've supported India probably because of my father, who was a leg spinner in university, and he introduced the boys to cricket. And I remember watching our first cricket match in the MCG in the 1970s with Dad, Australia versus England. We watched an Ashes Test match, and since then it's been a family tradition to go to every Boxing Day Test match at least one day, which I went this year despite COVID. So answering your question, yes, India's always been there, and the reason for that is it's not about citizenship. People have asked me, "Oh, why don't you support England or Australia?" If you look at the Indian team, it's interesting. It's like a Bollywood movie. There's tragedy, there's happiness, there's sadness. The Indian cricket team is the most challenging one to follow because 9 out of 10, at least in the past, they disappointed you. But they always excited you. They were never a clinically predictable team. It's like some of the Italian football teams. You're always ripping your hair out or swearing at them, but you can't leave them because there's so much passion about them. And the same thing about the Indian cricket team. There's so much passion about them. And if you saw this year, I don't know if you saw any of them, the youngsters, how they won at the Gabba. And that's incredible. No one gave them any odds. Remember, they were 36 all out in the first test match in Adelaide, completely written off. But if you look at all the podcast interviews and YouTube videos about, and then Crick Info or Crick Buzz, you'll realize how much admiration the Indians had, not just from the Indians, but from people around the world. Even the Australians said, amazing. And I think that's a characteristic of Australia, that people in Australia respect the underdog and people who are fighters. And I think the Indian team proved that. So from the answer of that question, there's a passion for there, but it's reinforced by the exploits of the young Indian team that you see now.
Ram, before we wrap it up, and I give David the opportunity to throw one more maybe migration question at you, I've got 2 more that are cricket related, and I think my second one's going to be harder. But first, best cricket ground, MCG, yes or no?
I would say yes and no. The reason, I'm sorry to say that, my early experiences were MCG, but I'm actually a member of the SCG. So I'm what I like about the SCG is that they still have the members and the ladies pavilion left as heritage property. So if you look at it, it's a beautiful green original. I don't know if you've been to the SCG a few times. I haven't. I'm a member, and I went last year. Unfortunately, this year I couldn't go because of COVID-19. And I have a GP friend I meet up there, and we go to the cricket. And it's just amazing, the SCG. And I love Sydney. I spent 5 years there. I love to visit. Mind you, I love living in Melbourne, but I love Sydney to visit. The MCG has got a lot of family memories in it, so there's a lot of attachment to it from that point of view. So I think it's a magnificent stadium, but it's become very modernized. I saw the MCG in the 70s first, and how it's now, it's completely modernized. So I like the MCG from experience, but I think it's become very corporate and it's less emotional compared to the SCG. I've also been to most of the grounds in England, from Lords to Edgbaston to Trent Bridge to Southampton, the Rose Bowl, and Old Trafford and Manchester, and so on. They're all great grounds. Lords is amazing. I'm a life member of Middlesex County Cricket Club, so I've visited Lords many times, and I've actually watched matches in the long room, and it's just Lords. It's not a huge ground. I think the capacity is only 25 or 28,000. So they say you can actually put it inside the middle of the MCG. But it's an amazing ground with history, and the SCG is a little bit like that. I also recently visited in India this year, just on the outside, Motera Stadium. You might have seen, I think it's called the Modi Stadium, which they're recently playing matches. Apparently, it's the largest cricket ground in the world now. It overtook the MCG. I think the capacity is about 110,000 versus 100,000. And it's a magnificent stadium because the lighting is, there's no pylons, there's actually completely LED lit. So it's the most green, environmentally friendly cricket ground in the world. It uses recycled water and all sorts of things. So it's amazing. And they have like 12 pitches, and they have 4 dressing rooms, and they have, an indoor training centre. So I think cricket's evolving, particularly in the subcontinent. So, and I've seen cricket matches in the West Indies as well. So Queen's Park Oval in Trinidad, I've had the pleasure. So it's hard to say what's my favourite ground. I love the SCG. I have fond memories of the MCG, but there's so many grounds. My dream life would be to go from country to country and watch cricket in so many different countries. South Africa is another one I'd like to go to.
Hopefully, this question's harder, given your cultural background and your I don't want to say divided loyalties, but your familiarity with the different cultures. In your best ever world team, who's first picked? Is it MS Dhoni, Jimmy Anderson, or Ricky Ponting?
Best ever team. It depends. Is it for test or one-day matches?
Oh, well, that goes without saying. The tests are the only games. Yeah.
But the three are so. Do I have to just choose one of them? Is it?
Who's first pick? They're all going to get in the team. But when you sit down at your selection meeting, who do you pick first?
Who's Ponting, Dhoni, and who's the other one?
Jimmy Anderson.
Wow. Look, overall, I would say if you have to pick only one person, and that person will end up being the captain, I would probably pick MS Dhoni, because he's just got a cricketing mind beyond anyone. It's just amazing, and he's captain cool, and he's just it's amazing. But the other's a specialist batsman, and the other one's a specialist bowler. But if you could allow me to pick Steve Smith, I would have picked Steve Smith.
Oh, gee, I'm still furious at him for Sandpaper Gate, so I wouldn't let him near a best of team. So
yeah, but an interesting question about this cricket loyalty and so on. A lot of people have asked me, you've spent so many years from India. How do you relate still back to the mother country as an Indian who's lived all your life overseas? And I think the key to that is popular culture. And I think that's something that's related to a lot of youngsters. And the two important things in popular culture in India is we're not talking about tradition. We're not talking about, spirituality, religion, or whatever. We're talking about popular culture, which youngsters can identify, or any generation. And the two things is one is Bollywood, Indian movies, and the other thing, or movies, and the other thing is cricket. So if you can understand cricket and Bollywood, and that's for anyone, even as an Australian. I think a lot of Australians do. I'm incredibly surprised how many Australians come up to me and said, "Yeah, I know who Shah Rukh Khan is. I've seen this movie, or I know I've seen this movie or that movie or this song." And then that is a gateway to modern India. So if you understand cricket and Bollywood, you will understand modern India, because India is totally different from what you've expected. I don't know if either of you have been to India. It's not a land of magical carpets and snake charmers and all different religions and so on, which is the typical people talk about. It's a completely modernized society. It's completely, sure, it's a lot of it's traditional. It's like, when I first visited Italy and Greece, there used to be a joke, this is where people used to think in Australia, Greek Australians used to think the church and the donkeys used to be. And they said, no, there's no church or donkeys here. This is where the nightclub and this is where the shopping mall is. It's totally same with Italy. Italy's moved on so much. If you go back to Italy and you see how modernized and it's different it is, the Italians who are here, if they don't go back to Italy, they're stuck in time. Same thing with the Indians. When you go back to India, you realize, like, if you go to cities like Mumbai, it's no different from New York, London, or Paris. It's so fast.
My last question, Ram. My last question. You talk about cricket raising awareness and also prickling the conscience and making you aware of your roots, and Bollywood cinema. What, for those who've been fascinated by the interview and interested in what you've had to say, what are 3 films you'd recommend from Bollywood for people who are not familiar with Bollywood cinema?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I'll have to think of recent ones.
I love the Lunchbox. I love the Lunchbox.
Yeah, the Lunchbox is good. If you like social things, Padman is good. That's a good movie. Let me think. If you like, there's a lot of sporting movies they've made. They've actually made a movie called MS Dhoni, and they're making a movie called 1983, which is about India's 1983 victory with Kapil Dev against the West Indies. There's also one called with Salman Khan that's famous, which is called I'm just trying to think what it's called. It's a wrestling movie. That's a good movie. And there's another movie that's called Dangal with Amir Khan. It's based on a true movie. It's very good because it's about a gentleman who used to be a wrestler who represented India, but he didn't quite make it. So he obviously wanted to pass that skill on to the next generation. And he was from a society which obviously favored having sons. So he was looking forward to his sons becoming wrestlers. So because of biology, he couldn't have sons. Interesting enough, sex is not determined by the spouse or the female, but by the male. Medically, so it's interesting to note, whether you have daughters or sons, it's determined by the man, not by the female, because the chromosomes come from the male. So that aside, he ended up having multiple daughters. And what he did was revolutionary in the time in the 1980s and 90s, is he made his daughters into wrestlers. And 2 of his daughters represented India in the Commonwealth Games and won gold medals. So that's a very interesting movie. Dangal, it's called. It's good because
it's a beauty.
Social thing. Yeah, you'd like that movie. So I think they're making a lot of good sporting movies, but they've also interesting. Netflix has got a lot of interesting Indian sort of shorts and series, like White Tiger is one,
and the detective
Bombay
series.
Begums,
Yeah,
and all Bombay Begums and stuff. So if you watch that, you will understand where new India is going. India's completely changed in the sense, sure, family is there, tradition is there, but it's a get up and go, very modernized country. India wants to be a happening place. Young people have a lot of aspirations to get things done and to modernize India. And I think that's going. There's another one called Mission Mangal. I don't know whether you've heard it. It's about India's space program, and it's India has at the moment, I think it was the first country in the world and the first attempt to successfully have a satellite which is orbiting Mars. So, and I believe in the next couple of years they're going to have astronauts. India's planning that at the moment. So they'll be the fourth country, I think, in the world after Russia, United States, China, to have a man or a woman in space. But that's a good movie as well, because India's space program is largely the behind scenes are women. So that's something also to keep in mind, that Indian women have traditional roles, but the modern Indian woman is very smart, very ambitious, and above all, very capable.
Dr. Ram Nadathi, you've been wonderful. You've been wonderful. Fascinating chat. Thanks for coming by.
And remember,
thank you for having me both.
And Ram, I hope everyone that you come across in any emergency room is nice and polite and understands that it's a very stressful work environment, and that they appreciate the long road that it takes to get to where you are when you're pushing and prodding them when they're lying on a trolley, screaming at you.
I hope so.
So, yeah.
Thanks for being a part of the program, Ram. You've been wonderful.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
David,
I enjoyed it, really. Thank you for having me.
David, where can people get hold of you if they need some advice?
Fastest way is via direct message on Twitter at David Bongiorno, David Bongiorno, Bongorno, one word, and that is the fastest way.
Terrific. And well, Thursday night we did get some questions, which we love. Bit of a different flavour to our Saturday programs. Thanks, Ram, again for being part of the show. Migrating to Australia. I'm Grant Williams. See you next time.